Uhuru Sasa. We just completed the Jazz Zone with TM Providence. We were doing a rerun of Oscar Emmanuel Peterson. Oscar Peterson is, we are celebrating his centenary. And joining us on the line is Dr. Gerald Horne. Dr. Gerald Horne is the author of about 50 books. He is the John J. and Rebecca Moore's Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. And we are delighted to have Dr. Horne on. And we wanted to, I guess, begin with the burning issue of Ukraine and the UE and U.S.-Russia situation.
Well, as you know, as our audience knows, there was the Alaska Summit, which myself and others interpreted as a potential setback for U.S. imperialism, insofar as during that summit, Mr. Trump seemed to be trying to build a bridge to Russia, which flies in the face of European leadership policy, which was reflected when many of these European leaders, including Chancellor Merz, President Macron, Prime Minister Starmer, Prime Minister Maloney, Ursula von der Leyen, head of the European Commission, Mark Rutte, the head of NATO, they trooped to Washington as a sort of bodyguard for Mr. Zelensky to protect him from presumed verbal assaults, which he experienced a few months ago in the Oval Office. Mr. Trump, exemplifying what he is known for, that is to say, he tends to reflect the wishes of the last parties he spoke with, seemed to be moving away from his position at the Alaska Summit. There was talk on Fox and Friends, a popular chat show, that the United States might supply air power to so-called peacekeeping forces in Ukraine, which Russia sternly objects to, needless to say. And certainly Chancellor Merz really pushed strongly for a ceasefire, and that is a tell, as the poker players say, because the party that's usually losing wants avidly a ceasefire so that they can rearm, and that's been the history of ceasefires in that conflict, whereas the party that is advancing, which is Russia, as we saw, is adamantly opposed to a ceasefire. They say that they want an entire peace settlement. Now, one tidbit of news that I think is revealing is that according to the Financial Times of London, the European auto industry is really suffering, and that has been the locomotive of the capitalist economy in Europe. I'm speaking of Volkswagen, BMW, Mercedes-Benz, Renault, etc. They are facing a challenge not only from Chinese vehicles, particularly BYD, and needless to say, Chinese interests are proceeding and advancing by leaps and bounds in terms of that technology. In fact, according to press reports, certain Chinese vehicles can be recharged in a few minutes, believe it or not. Whereas the Trump administration is still treating the Europeans like the vassals that they are and has upped tariffs against European exports, which will not necessarily be a boon to the European auto industry. And according to Financial Times, what's happening now is that the wise investors are shorting the European automotive manufacturers. What that means is they plan to profit as the stock price goes down of Renault, BMW, Volkswagen, Mercedes, etc. And that, it seems to me, is the ultimate commentary. That is to say that the Europeans are being pressed on all sides. The Wall Street Journal had a revealing story just this past Saturday, speaking of yesterday, where they really portrayed a dismal economic outlook for the European and quoted Jamie Dimon, who, by the way, is not only the leading banker in the United States of America, but interestingly enough, happens to be of Greek Jewish extraction. He says the Europeans are losing, and he is in a position to know. So the Europeans would be wise to try to cut a deal with Russia, but somehow that does not seem to be in the cards. And apparently, this conflict will proceed in a bloody fashion.
You are listening to Diasporic Music on Black Power 96. I have a question for you before I turn it over to Melinda. How strong is the Ukrainian left in Ukraine and and abroad, especially in the United States of America?
Well, according to Norman Richmond, there is a sturdy Ukrainian left north of the border in Canada. With regard to the United States of America, if that phenomenon is duplicated here, they have not made their presence known to a measurable degree. With regard to Ukraine itself, I think that whatever Ukrainian left exists is outweighed and outnumbered by the neo-Nazi forces. They have more influence, and in fact, you probably should see those phenomena being connected. That is to say, the potency of the neo-Nazi faction in Ukraine, like a seesaw, helping to determine that the Ukrainian left is not measurable in impact.
Well, let me say that the Ukrainian left, I was talking about the Ukrainian left at once upon a time. Today, 2025, I don't think I don't want to give anybody the impression that there's a flaming Ukrainian left in Canada or Toronto in 2025. If I did.
Fair enough.
Melinda, I think you had some questions, right?
I don't know. Did you touch on U.S. and Belarus since we're in Europe?
Well, what's interesting, the shady, shifty Mr. Trump, in the prelude to the meeting in Alaska with Mr. Putin, he reached out to President Lukashenko of Belarus in Minsk, which is quite extraordinary because Minsk, Belarus, has been treated like the evil twin of Russia, particularly by the neoconservatives, even by the Trump faction of the ruling class. And when he reached out to Mr. Lukashenko, I assumed that this was part of a shifty U.S. imperialist strategy whereby Washington feels that if it can gain a foothold in Belarus, that it will gain leverage against Moscow. Likewise, as we've reported previously, and it's worthy of reiteration, that one of the reasons, in my estimation, why Mr. Trump was seeking the Alaska summit to build a bridge to Moscow was because there are other pressure points against Moscow that can be pressed. I'm thinking not only of Belarus, but Armenia and Azerbaijan, which Mr. Trump brought together in Washington some days ago for a so-called peace pact. Those two nations also have proximity to Iran, which gives them even more strategic importance. So I should also mention that during the time that Belarus was being boycotted by Washington and by the North Atlantic Camp generally, Mr. Lukashenko, believe it or not, could be found more often than you would imagine in Zimbabwe, of all places, because Zimbabwe is seen as a regime worthy of boycott, and therefore they found a like-minded regime in Minsk. So it'll be interesting to see how Lukashenko and Belarus respond to these overtures from Mr. Trump, which, to my knowledge, have not been replicated by Western Europe.
You're listening to Diasporic Music, Diasporic Music on Black Power 96. Dr. Horne, the Houston Institute, and could you talk about the Houston Institute and China? And first of all, what is the Hudson Institute? Sorry.
Hudson Institute is a neoconservative think tank. And I only bring this up because a few days ago, I was in Kansas. And I had a long drive to Abilene, where the Dwight Eisenhower Library is located. Recall that he was the U.S. president from roughly 53 to 61, where I was looking at documents on the Korean War and China. And by the way, I was also looking at documents on Ethiopia, because Ethiopia joined the United States in the intervention on the Korean Peninsula between, say, 1950 and 1953. And then His Imperial Majesty Haile Selassie was rewarded, so to speak, by given red carpet treatment in Washington, which was quite extraordinary, given the fact that most of Africa was colonized, and the last head of state from Africa to visit the United States was the head of Liberia in 1943. And just as a footnote, and then perhaps someone can brief me on it, as I was going through the delegation, it struck me that His Imperial Majesty's delegation, all men, needless to say, but all were unmarried. And I don't know, somehow I found that noteworthy, and if someone can explain how and why that was, I'd appreciate it. But in any case, on this long drive to Abilene, I wanted to occupy my time. So I put on this 3-hour session of the Hudson Institute talking about what's going to happen after the Chinese Communist Party is overthrown, believe it or not.
Mm-hmm.
And they said that Washington should train 10,000 Chinese language specialists to arrive in China after the party is overthrown. They were scratching their heads as to what to do with the 100 million strong membership of the Chinese Communist Party. Not enough jail cells for 100 million people. I shudder to think what they have in store for the Chinese Communist Party. And of course, they talked about seizing all Chinese interests here in the United States of America, including Smithfield, which is a major pork producer in the United States, in the Carolinas, in fact, and it's controlled by Chinese interests. They say that and other interests should be seized. And they talked about seizing other Chinese assets. So I didn't know how to take this. I mean, I have to confess that after the Soviet Union collapse, I don't necessarily rule out anything extraordinary happening. But at the same time, given the growth rates in China and given the clear advantages that China has over the United States in terms of so many key technologies, particularly clean energy, but also quantum computing, AI, artificial intelligence to a certain degree, perhaps the Hudson Institute would be spending their time more effectively if they contemplated what happens after capitalism and imperialism are overthrown in North America.
You're listening to Diasporic Music on Black Power 96. Now, one of the criticisms that Dr. Gerald Horne receives is that you are too sympathetic, or your position on China is off. Some go so far as to say that China is an imperialist country, and so on and so forth. How do you respond to that?
Well, I'm in the process of writing a book that plots how China got to this exalted position. And as I've told a number of podcasters in the recent past, the fact is that in 1979, I found myself in Vietnam after China and Vietnam had been in a conflict. Now, obviously, I was in sympathy with Vietnam. I also visited Cambodia, Cambodia, after the Vietnamese had overthrown the murderous genocidal Khmer Rouge, which had been backed by China, and then the United States and China collaborated with regard to a campaign against Vietnam that lasted for a number of years. Also, as a footnote, next Thursday, I'll be in Detroit at the Wayne State University Reuther Library looking at the papers of Leonard Woodcock, the leader of the United Auto Workers, who became the first U.S. ambassador to China and shepherded the movement of entire industrial plants across the Pacific from the United States into China, helping to build this juggernaut. So I don't know. I mean, people can believe what they want to believe. I would like to think that I try to provide an objective analysis. And as is oftentimes said in Britain, if the temperature changes, you should not blame the thermometer for registering that. And that is to say that if China is waging war against Vietnam, I'm critical. If China is under the gun from imperialism, I'm supportive. I mean, it seems obvious to me, but perhaps I'm missing something.
You're listening to Walk Music on Black Talk 96. Melinda, you have some questions, correct?
Yeah, since we're in China, why don't we talk about Modi in China?
Talk about what? I missed that.
Modi in China?
Sorry, Prime Minister Modi. Sorry about that. Yeah. So this is part of Trump's strategy that many of us don't understand. That is to say that many of us assume that he was pursuing an anti-China strategy, which involves a preeminent role for India, which has had severe conflict with China over the decades, including a de facto war in 1962, not to mention sharp border clashes since then. However, Mr. Trump is now issuing sanctions or tariffs against India for buying Russian oil. And India has responded, understandably, by warming relations with China, which I'm trying to figure out how that's in the interest of U.S. imperialism. Perhaps Mr. Trump is just being incoherent. Perhaps that's the explanation, because he's also warming relations with Pakistan, which is India's long-term foe. But at the same time, he's doing that, Pakistan remains close to China. Recall that during the Cold War, the lineup was India and the Soviet Union versus Pakistan and China. And so, Mr. Trump, if he has a strategy, I'd like to know what it is. But in any case, many analysts are very critical of him in that regard. And I should say as well that Mr. Trump seems to be more interested in punishing his foes as much as anything else. His campaign of retribution, I'm sure you heard about the raid on the home of his former national security advisor, John Bolton. It carted away boxes of documents he suspected of violating the law with regard to having in his personal possession national security documents. They also raided his office in Washington, D.C. Mr. Bolton wrote an entire book critical of Mr. Trump. The New York Times says that Mr. Trump's ultimate ambition is to put Barack Obama in jail. He's campaigning against Lisa Cook, one of the most powerful Black women in the United States of America. She is a member of the Federal Reserve Bank, the central bank of the United States of America. And she stood by the leader of the Federal Reserve, Jay Powell, as he's resisted Mr. Trump's demand so far that interest rates be reduced. They want to put her in jail too. He wants to put in jail Latisha James, the Black woman who has sued him more than once and has won major judgments. She's the Attorney General of the state of New York. So there's this campaign against many of his real and imagined opponents. And I must say that what's happening in the United States is proceeding like clockwork. That is to say, many predicted in the 1950s that when the liberals joined the conservatives in routing those to their left, particularly the communists and those in their orbit, that after that dirty work was done, the conservatives would then go after the liberals. And that's what's happening today. It's clear as the nose on your face. And that is something that's cognizable and recognizable. This attempt at retribution, attempt to punish and pulverize the political opponents of Mr. Trump. With regard to diplomatic and political strategy for U.S. imperialism, that seems to be a dog's breakfast, as they say in Rhodesia, Zimbabwe. That is to say, it seems to be kind of a mess, particularly given the attempt to turn India into an antagonist of U.S. imperialism.
You are listening to Diasporic Music on Black Power 96. We are on the line with Dr. Gerald Horne. And I have a question for you, Dr. Horne, about can we talk about the new Israel and Iran war? And I wanted to know, in Iran, because, Iran is supposedly, not necessarily a secular state, but the left is united with the Iranian, the rulers of Iran, because they're being attacked by Israel. Am I correct in saying that?
Not only attacked by Israel, but attacked by U.S. imperialism. And the Iranian left, particularly the Tudeh party, Tudeh, has the good sense to not join with Israel and U.S. imperialism in seeking to undermine the Islamic Republic, even though clearly they have contradictions and tensions with the Islamic Republic. I mean, of course, some of your friends in Canada are holier than thou, who expect us to attack China, even though China's under the gun. I assume that they would expect us to attack Iran too. Somehow join hands with Israel and U.S. imperialism. But in any case, many sage and wise analysts are predicting a shooting war between Iran and Israel before the end of the year. And I think that also sheds light, once again, on Mr. Trump seeking to build bridges towards Moscow, because U.S. imperialism, as we've said more than once, is involved in a process of imperial overstretch. That is to say, being $37 trillion in debt, they don't necessarily have the resources to confront China and Russia and Iran, North Korea and Cuba and Venezuela simultaneously. So they would like to take Russia off the board, remove it, because Russia is basically the political commissar of the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. In fact, the BRICS in many ways was an idea from that very same political commissar, speaking of Russia, circa 2009. And so this idea that Israel will attack Iran is not far-fetched at all. The problem for Israel is that they had to call upon Daddy Trump to pull their chestnuts out of the fire in June 2025, and Daddy Trump responded. But Israel is hemorrhaging citizenry. They're moving to Cyprus, driving up real estate prices. They're moving to Brooklyn. They're moving to Australia, moving to Europe. There is protests in the streets of Israel over the hostage or the captive situation. That is to say, those held by Hamas since October 7, 2023. There is discontent amongst the ultra-Orthodox who do not want to be conscripted and have taken to the streets in response, and their political parties are threatening to pull out of the Netanyahu coalition unless their wishes are granted. So Israel is like the fictional French military man who suggests my left flank is retreating, my right flank is collapsing, situation excellent, advance. In other words, Israel is severely wounded, and I assume it feels that the way to resolve its problem is to get involved in a shooting war, whereby the citizenry's impulse will be to rally around the flag. Certainly that'll be the impulse amongst the pro-Zionist community in the United States of America, not to mention the Zionist billionaires. But it's a very dangerous strategy indeed.
You're listening to Diasporic Music. We're on with Dr. Gerald Horne, and we have some more questions, Belinda.
Yeah, since we're talking about Israel, let's talk about the Palestine crisis.
Well, the latest news is rather sobering. Apparently, there is a famine that is gripping historic Palestine. There are plans by the Israelis already in motion to launch a major offensive in Gaza. In that respect, you've had a call up of reservists by the Zionist entity. At the same time, there is loose talk about expelling the Palestinians to Africa, to South Sudan, which seems to be the receptacle for those who are being ousted from the United States of America. I'm speaking of undocumented workers who have been dropped into South Sudan. Now there's talk about dropping Palestinians into South Sudan. At the same time, that country is on fire. Internecine conflict within the ruling party, not to mention in nearby Sudan, the larger Sudan, there is a bleeding sore, a conflict that is stretching out interminably to our dismay. And so we really need to step up our campaign in solidarity with the Palestinians, because it's not unfair to suggest that a slow motion genocide is unfolding before our very eyes.
You're listening to Diasporic Music with Linda Francis, Norman Richmond, Lisa Watson is on the buttons. And Dr. Horne, could we talk about the bounty on the head of state of Venezuela, Mr. Comrade Maduro?
Very distressing. $50 million, more than that was placed. It's more than the number or the cash amount that was placed in terms of a bounty on the head of Osama bin Laden before he was killed during the Obama years. What I found particularly distressing, I must say, is that the Prime Minister of Trinidad and Tobago has welcomed this U.S. flotilla that is now cruising off the shores of Venezuela. In fact, similar words have emanated from Guyana. Now, to a certain extent, I understand Guyana because there's this border conflict between Venezuela and Guyana over the Essequibo region. And Guyana has some of the most impressive growth rates in the world because of the uncovering petroleum deposits. And as a result, the many Guyanese have become very close to U.S. imperialism. And I take it that the Port of Spain, Trinidad and Tobago, is engaged in solidarity, or what they perceive to be solidarity, with Guyana. But in any event, it's quite worrisome, because if that is the sentiment in Trinidad and Guyana, it would not surprise me at all if there were similar sentiments in other CARICOM nations, Barbados, Jamaica, for example. On the other hand, Mr. Maduro is not sitting on his hands. Apparently, he has armed the masses, to use the slogan that was popular, believe it or not, in Harlem in the 1980s by some of my comrades, shall we say. And there is a militia that has been armed, apparently in the millions. And the Maduro regime says they're ready for a invasion. It's no secret that Mr. Trump wants to seize the oil of Venezuela. He said that more than once, on more than one occasion. The New York Times suggests that this is just a show to put pressure on Caracas so that they'll be more willing to accept Venezuelans in the United States, undocumented, who will be expelled back to their homeland. I'm not so sure, because Venezuela welcomed Venezuelans who were expelled from El Salvador just a few weeks ago. In any case, it's a very perilous and dangerous situation. I've suggested that our friends in Washington, D.C., who are likewise under the gun, they're being treated like guinea pigs in a neo-fascist experiment, with National Guards persons being deployed to the streets, with our youth being rounded up, with the chief prosecutor or U.S. attorney suggesting that those who are carrying long guns, rifles, and shotguns openly, who tend to be Trump supporters in the streets of Washington, they will not necessarily be penalized. But those with handguns, which I take it that they feel that that's people like us, they will have the book thrown at them. So obviously, our folks in D.C. are desperately in need of solidarity. The people and the masses of Venezuela are desperately in need of solidarity. It seems like a marriage made in heaven.
I think that's going to close the door on us, Comrade Horne.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
All right, and I would like to thank Melinda Francis, and definitely like to thank Lisa Watson for keeping us sounding good. And Melinda Francis, would you like to, you have any parting words for our listeners?
Yes, I hope all our listeners stay safe during the week, and yeah, keep learning for back August. We have one more week, and yeah, we'll see everybody in the whirlwind next week.
We state these facts only to let you know that those of us who are revolutionary, Pan-Africanists, is not because we love revolution. It is historically determined, and we have no alternative but to follow history and to use history for the benefit of our people.